But go for it.
So we get a red light or something?
Yeah, red light's on.
Okay.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is episode 20. Woohoo! We made it! Of the Web Platform Podcast. Your host today is myself, Eric Isaacson, a senior UX engineer at 3 Pillar Global. Today we have special guests from Mozilla, Soledad Penades. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. GIF or GIF, depending on where you stand. Hacktivist and Mozilla Apps Engineer. And Matt Claypotch, who is also Mozilla Apps Engineer and lead on the Brick project. So today we're going to be talking about web components and Brick. So welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. What is this Brick thing that we've been hearing about?
So Brick is it's a collection of web components based around the idea that not everyone is a rock star around building mobile UI, and mobile UI is different enough and has a different enough set of needs from desktop that things like Bootstrap really don't necessarily fit the bill. So Brick is sort of using web components tech to build a collection of UI pieces that can be composed together into building web application UI, specifically around mobile.
Okay, so it is mobile first in its practice for building
mobile first in its practice, absolutely. You know, there's intention to add more responsive and desktop friendly things, but mobile is the first focus. And as you've astutely seen, I sometimes refer to it as sort of maybe possibly a UI kit for the web, where really some nice higher level widgets that can be composed to build UI.
And are these easily themable?
Yeah. The story around theming has changed a little bit with the advent of Shadow DOM, and we're still trying to navigate sort of how that works. But the intention is that theming Brick components is actually as easy as possible. We can get into that a little bit more.
Sure. I've used Polymer quite a bit extensively. I played around with Xtag a little. I haven't really used Brick. I know Rob Dotson talked about Brick a little bit, where he used a specific component that you guys had that he really liked, and one of his interop presentations. So how does Brick really differentiate itself from the other libraries or pieces on top of web components?
The big thing about Brick that differentiates it from, at least in particular, Polymer, is that Polymer is sort of built on top of the Polymer sort of core set of libraries, which is a library on top of a standard, and then the components are built on top of that library. So it's actually a framework for building web components, and then the Polymer collection of components is constructed on top of that, whereas Brick's goal is actually to be constructed directly on top of the web component standards with as little abstraction between them as possible. The idea being when the web component standards are baked into browsers, really you can just grab a component off the shelf and use it, and you don't necessarily have to have this central dependency that everything relies on. So really trying to build straight to the spec and run on top of the web. I hesitate to use the words bare metal, but here we are.
From an educational standpoint, it sounds like that would be a very hard challenge. I agree with you. When I first started working with web components, one of the things that was really core to me was I want to understand how this works underneath, and I want to build from JavaScript, from the native, like how I would do this, and using the polyfills, obviously. But I didn't want to use Polymer. I resisted it a lot. But they abstracted it and made it very nice to work with, and it was an easy learning curve. So if I come in from Angular or some other framework that I'm familiar with, that it's not that much of a mind shift. But I found when I show people demos of basic web components, because it's so new and it's fantastic, I actually really like working closer to the metal, as you say. But it's much more of a learning curve, and you really have to know JavaScript pretty well.
Now you're gonna take that buzzwordy term and hit me with it for the rest of the podcast.
No, I say it all the time. I say it all the time too. So it's a great analogy.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely more of an educational curve, both because you're really working with some core JavaScript primitives. I mean, if you're not super familiar with JavaScript, you're dealing directly with prototypes, HTML element prototypes, and if you want to do anything fancy, you're dealing directly with getters and setters, and then sort of this really low-level callback-based API. I think so. There's that first level of educational challenge there. And there's the second educational challenge, which is because Polymer really is the 800-pound gorilla in the scene right now, it's very, very hard for people to mentally separate Polymer from web components. And I don't think that's really the Polymer team's fault. When I see Rob Dodson give talks, he's the great example. He's very, very careful to explain the difference between Polymer and actual web components technologies, and in fact generally shows the raw spec way of doing things in addition to the Polymer way of doing things. But they've got, I think they probably have the best syntactic sugar out there right now, and that's around building your own components. And I think that speaks to why there's so much confusion.
Yeah, and he's come on and said, even on this podcast, he said that's something that we're really working hard to separate because there's a lot of confusion, and they've admitted that a lot of that is on them and what they've done. But it's a personal goal of Rob to offset that. And as far as like separating that too, there's also the idea that, wow, is Polymer a replacement for Angular? And do I have to learn another framework? And I think that I don't want people to misunderstand that it's Brick or Polymer or Xtag or Bosonic. You have to only use one in a project. So can you talk about interop in that sense?
Yeah. One of the goals with Brick components, and the reason we're trying to be so slim in terms of requiring backing libraries, is ideally you should be able to pull a Brick component in and use it right alongside a Polymer component if that works, because they're both saying document register element at the core of things. They're both actually doing a real web components call, which means that as long as they're both speaking at that level, or there's interoperability at the level of the DOM, and which is the goal of Brick, to have everything be sort of a DOM level abstraction and pattern, if you see something that looks like an HTML element and you interact with it in a way that looks like an HTML element, it will work. So you should be able to possibly grab a Brick component and use it alongside a Bosonic component, or alongside a Polymer component, or alongside something you've built yourself. Also, because we're trying to act as much like the DOM as possible, there's no reason you couldn't manipulate a Brick component using jQuery, or manipulate a Brick component, or instantiate a Brick component using a templating language like Handlebars, or even possibly instantiate something in Angular using Angular's templating. We're not trying to necessarily be exclusive. By being more widget-based and not really trying to solve these higher-level app abstractions, the goal is that you would use Brick for the UI of a project that would possibly be built in another framework.
So when we had Rob on, we talked a little bit about his talk at the San Francisco HTML5 group on interop with different web components and different sets of web components, Polymer, Brick, Xtag, and others. So one thing we asked him was, so you've used this Brick element. Have you thought about extending a Brick element or another element inside of Polymer? Like taking the element and extending it using inheritance. So have you guys played around with inheritance?
No, I have not. Sully, have you tried to extend one custom element from another custom element?
Of course. So the problem with that is that, if there's a weird thing, I will try that. I tried extending various things. The problem is that if you have things like properties, kind of like internal state, how do you access that thing? Because you generally don't want to expose the internal state. It depends on how you build. If you're using proper prototypes and everything is in this dot something, you can change the value, but sometimes you don't want to change the value, so that's kind of like an internal variable. It highly depends. I haven't tried to extend using Polymer, but again, these components are JavaScript objects, so you should be able to use them. But again, you cannot really plug into the methods unless you really define the methods. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an issue with every web component in general. It's not just Brick with Polymer or Polymer with other web components. It's just an issue of how do you design software so that it can be rewritten, extended, and just like be used in the context of a bigger work. Because right now we are pushing for this kind of web components that are very self-contained and can't really be reused in any way. But how do you make things reusable? People are like, I should be able to reuse this new tag. Like, for example, a Twitter widget, you can set attributes, but there's only so much you can reuse until it stops being a Twitter widget and becomes an everything widget. So how do you plug and replace this part of the functionality? I think it's just software design in general. It's not just a matter of Polymer.
It took me a while to really figure out how I wanted to build the components because I'm used to this global namespace for everything, and then when you're dealing with these document fragments, it can, if you make it too complex, it becomes, it kind of defeats the purpose of the web components, right? You're supposed to have this composability. And so I found that I'm using content quite a bit more than I used to, the content tag. And I'm using attributes, obviously, but for anything that's deeply nested for communication, I end up using events, @IO for only 1 or 2 levels deep,
Yeah, I think we discovered pretty early on that sort of attributes and methods are sort of the primary ways of manipulating custom elements, or at least I've discovered this. And really, to hear back from them is a matter of events, and that's that's a very DOM pattern. And we actually even sort of take advantage of this. There's Brick action tag, which is really based on the concept of the X action tag, which just you give it a selector and an event to listen for, and then an ID of an element and the name of a method to call. And it's the simplest form of sort of the old HyperCard-esque wiring, where you say if an event happens here, call a method over here, and it gives you the way of just doing that most cursory stringing up this button to this drawer or this calendar to this input, and just really simple ways of almost declaratively doing event handling. It's not everyone likes it, but for mocking up, Soledad does not like it specifically.
I don't like it. I think it's too abstract. It's weird. It's not dummy, like dummy.
Yeah, I would say it's extremely hypercardy, which for people who are going to sit down and write a lot of JavaScript is not so great. But for people who are going to write a lot of HTML, it's nice. It has a nice feeling, and it at least codifies the notion that if you want an element or a tag to be able to be manipulated, then you should have a method on it that it can be called. And if you want a element to be able to be reacted to, it should be emitting an event. And that's sort of strongly preferring events and methods to all 100% attribute-based configuration and 100% sort of callback-based listening, really encouraging the event and method pattern. And I would say that's probably something that is kind of core to Brick in the direction we want to take it, is taking that pattern. And that's not substantially different from if you look at React, which is all about events bubbling up through the DOM as opposed to something where you're watching a specific element for a specific thing.
They use Flux typically with their apps at Facebook, right? So they're doing this unidirectional flow and they have a very specific way that they handle things with the dispatcher. And it gave me an idea too when I first heard about this was, what if you had like this master component that could handle all these and knew about these other components? Maybe a component controls your data and then passes it back. I never got to really experiment too much with it after that, but it's an interesting concept.
This is something we have argued about at length internally at Mozilla, which is sort of to what degree do we want to be programming using markup?
Right.
And I at first was extremely resistant to it, and now I'm sort of in the middle of the road where it's fine for some people, but you better definitely also provide a really direct JavaScript interface. Because if you're writing a complex web app, there's going to be JavaScript. No matter how you're going to be authoring JavaScript. I don't think it's an efficient thing to do to abstract that away to a tag. And being essentially programming using markup, I think it feels very visual. It feels very Visual Basic, and there are people for whom that's good. But if you want to be a general purpose library, you've got to be able to really manipulate these components directly in JavaScript. And I know Soledad has lots of thoughts on that.
Someone working on a web application is not necessarily a developer. They may come from a background that is development focused and working with JavaScript comes naturally, or working with logic in general, but they may be dabblers or designers or CMS people who they understand configuration, just like CI people would understand configuration, but they don't really necessarily know how to code. Some may, but the general idea is that you could code with markup, or you could code with JavaScript or scripting. It depends on what you're more comfortable with. Would you agree with that?
My issue is that the XML is a tree. It's a tree of things. The moment you start adding tags that do not have any visual representation and do not have any effect on the page. And you look at the code and you're like, what is happening here and why are things connected? Like, for example, I understand what Brick is doing with the action tag. And I guess once that becomes a established pattern, or once you become familiar with that, that makes total sense. But there's people doing that Ajax calls, and I saw someone having a config tag, and all the other components will refer to that config tag, and that's like a global variable, but in web components style.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty bad. I don't think that's good in any way for like maintainability or just for understanding how the thing is working. Like you look at the document and you're like, I don't even know how this thing is working. You need to be taught. Where if you look at that DOM tree and you can see things connected and contain, when you see hierarchy, which I cannot see with the other. You cannot with this kind of like very flat kind of document where things are mentioning each other and you don't know how it's happening. So that's I don't think it's a good. And again, I think because web components is so new, we're kind of reinventing everything, but we are just ignoring best practices from all previous software story, like decompose things, have things being small, but have some kind of, actually, I was reading about these principles called the Gestalt principles, where they discuss things like the human mind perceives things that are together as belonging to the same thing, and this kind of perception. And I think we are having this issue with software right now with all this declarativeness. Like you see all these things scattered around the page, and you cannot really form any sense of them because they might be connecting to each other in ways that you cannot really fathom. So I've been thinking a lot about the psychology of web components and how we are actually going to make them work for the general public, because for everyone they are so complex. With so much automatic, it's impossible to encourage adoption unless you come up with something like Polymer that gives you pre-built blocks.
In sort of parent-child relationship, where a lot of complex software applications aren't just sort of a parent with a bunch of children with a bunch of children with a bunch of children. If you take a look at the average project in any language that has, sort of libraries and modules, where this file, all these files may depend on some standard library, and then this file depends on these three files, and the dependency graph, while hopefully acyclic, is not a clean top-down tree, and to sort of express your app's structure as merely a tree, I think really limits the level of complexity your app can have before it becomes a real mess where everything must be a child of something, must be a child of something. And if there's implicit relationships in the structure and explicit relationships defined sort of in the context of the markup, it seems like it's going to really impact maintainability, and really it may even be a step backward from what we've gained from the advent of JavaScript modules. We made all this progress with JavaScript modules and the ability to really have these nice acyclic graphs and compile this stuff down and analyze dependency trees, and then to sort of just represent your entire application as HTML seems like a bit of a step backward for me. And I think there are some people for whom, I guess I think of more web components more really as a UI kit, really as maybe an interface builder file you pull in. It's an HTML file that represents the UI of your application, but I don't want my entire application being in the HTML. I guess that's where I absolutely agree with you. I think there's room to have UI-specific logic over in component land, but I don't want my app's business logic represented in HTML. And when I see stuff like that, that's where I start to get the itch on my scalp.
Yeah, it's like, why is this thing here? It's not real. Why? It's how. It's very weird for me. I get that. Maybe that's because I'm old or something. But like, no, that doesn't belong there.
The kids these days with their declarative syntax.
You guys bring up a really good point, though, and I think that it's good that we have the choice for this, and whether it's good or bad from that perspective, at least you can do it if you need to. But we are going to go through a period in web components, I think, where there's going to be this jQuery spaghetti. There's going to be like DOM spaghetti, right? Mm-hmm. So there's going to be applications that people are just learning. They don't really know how to compose applications, or especially since there's not much on building production-ready applications out there as far as tutorials go. There's a few, but there's not a lot with web components.
It's just like, hey, this is how you build web components. Okay, first, download Polymer. And
yeah.
No, and then you just do a simple super button, and that's like, well, that's not a very complex component. So it doesn't really go that far away. I think that's something we wanted to look into. Like, how can we investigate how to build complex web components and like put them in production and what kind of the challenges? That's what we are kind of like maybe looking into at some point, so that more people can do that instead of just stopping at the super button or the X video tag, so you can play video with your webcam or something, which is great. It's great, but it doesn't really solve complex issues.
What you're hearing now is sort of a lot of the thinking behind sort of Brick's next direction, which is not so much trying to make a Polymer not by Google, but trying to make sort of a hybrid web components approach that really takes into account all the advances we've made in what it means to build a complex web application, in the past few years, and not necessarily try to shift any paradigms except for possibly around how easy it is to instantiate a widget, which is I think a much smaller charter, but that's good because you have a much smaller team.
I pair program a lot too, so a lot of people that I've worked with, they don't necessarily see the value of having web components yet, because they're looking at the browser matrices and say, well, like it's only evergreen development, and they're looking at what their clients' needs are. Well, we can just get this solved with Ember or React or Angular.
Absolutely. I completely understand that notion, and that's something that we've struggled with, particularly sort of as we moved from Brick 1 to Brick 2, we decided to really embrace web components, all the technologies. Originally, Brick was really just custom elements, and as custom elements using the custom elements polyfill provided inside of Xtag. And we decided that, well, if we're going to use all of the standards, then we should probably use Polymer's platform.js, which I believe they just broke out into its own project now. I believe it's called webcomponents.js.
I got a pull request waiting for you guys on GitHub.
Awesome. That's actually lovely news. And what we discovered is that the moment we did that, our browser compatibility matrix went right out the window. And actually, the most impactful issue we've run into is around something that's near and dear to our heart, which is Firefox OS. I mean, sort of the reason that the apps engineering team at Mozilla exists is to try to build solutions that are both great for the open web, but are keeping things, are making sure that Mozilla is well represented in those things. So we want this stuff to be amazing, but it needs to work on Firefox OS, obviously. And one of the issues that we discovered is that the security model in Firefox OS is very, very strict around what sort of unsafe things you can do, particularly around eval. And it turns out that the only easy way to polyfill HTML imports is by ajaxally loading, asynchronously pulling in a JavaScript file over, XHR and then evaling it, or dynamically loading a script tag, which is essentially the exact same thing as eval, and it's actually being prevented. So what we discovered, much to our chagrin, is that trying to use HTML imports, and even to an extent using the Shadow DOM polyfill, has actually torpedoed our compatibility matrix, and is actually leading us to revisit that decision with expediency. So maybe you've heard it here first, but we're actually probably moving back to a just custom elements based solution, and actually shying away from some of the other standards that make up the web components family.
Have you considered looking at Bosonic's Shadow DOM polyfill?
We have not.
So he considers it more composition. He doesn't end up, I should say the project does not stub out the encapsulation, which makes it much more performant. But you don't get that encapsulation for real, right? So it's just more about composability.
Well, what we've also discovered is that because Brick's components are so much about composability, and so much about that most Brick components contain other general DOM, that really we don't really need that much Shadow DOM. And the sort of style encapsulation that we do need, if you take a look at things like Code Mirror or some of the BEM stuff that's being patterned by Yandex and stuff like that, properly namespaced styles are indistinguishable from Shadow DOM, or sufficiently namespaced styles are indistinguishable from Shadow DOM. I think the way we may head is to actually eschew the whole notion that these components actually need to look like black boxes, and which also impacts skinnability, we discovered.
Oh, yeah.
And by discovered, I mean should have been obvious. And maybe just move to a system by which, the reason I say code mirrors, if you ever inspected a code mirror instance on a web page, JSBin or something like that, you can see that it's code mirror dash something for all of the classes. And how many code mirrors have you seen with the page's styles in them? Not very many. Styles really don't bleed if people are being good about class naming, and then you stick to the cardinal rule of maybe you shouldn't globally style a tag. That solves most of the style encapsulation issues and really preserves the whole notion that a web page is this hackable tree and not this system of black boxes. I mean, web developers, I think it's a common joke about how hard it is to style a select box. Shadow DOM encourages everyone to make select boxes out of every part of their entire application. It's weird that we get frustrated at browser vendors for making these impenetrable widgets that we can't style, and then people are rushing to embrace the technology that allows that exact same lockout. Why can't I hack this widget, but I don't want anyone touching my widget? And I think maybe that's the fundamentally Mozilla thing that we're discovering, is that the web should really be hackable, and that if a user wants to make your component ugly, it's their right to make their component ugly. It's on their page. If you really don't want that, do an iframe, do a Facebook button. But skinnability and hackability is pretty fundamental to the web, and I guess the black box technologies, in addition to not having backwards compatibility and having all these other properties that are extremely inconvenient, also have this property that they're changing that read-write hackability of web technology that is so cool.
So does that mean that you guys don't embrace the Shadow DOM? Like you don't think it's a good thing now, or you do? I don't know.
I think there's a place for Shadow DOM, but not for all the tags, but only for the good tags, which is the really complex widgets, like the ones I'm trying to build. I don't want any style to kind of like bleed inside, because if you try to build like I haven't gone to that point yet, but suppose I build something which has lots of things that need to be aligned properly because it's like a complex widget. I don't want things to be like, suppose something is touching all the P elements and is setting them to flex something, and they change my suppositions, which is a different type of flex, and how do I stop that from happening? I think there has a place for that in that case. I think that's a very good point. Like I do kind of like custom, really complex widgets. Don't get into it. It's like if your styles would bleed into the video tag, it would be a mess. But you also want the progress bar in the right place and with the right amount of padding. You don't want other things to get into. And in any case, the Shadow DOM thing is not that good of a black box, because you can actually start with the special shadow or whatever selector. But then what we found actually is that if you want this thing to work with other browsers that do not support Shadow DOM, you have to double the number of selectors. So you ended up with double the CSS selector amount for the same kind of CSS, and it was a mess, basically.
Yeah, I almost want some sort of upstream. I want my encapsulation almost to have this upstream filter, which is, you know what? If the user is has a selector called brick-calendar.day, then they're trying to skin my component. That's great. But if they're trying to style the A tag, ignore it. They're trying to globally style an A tag. Shadow DOM is really, it's like we're starting from zero, and then we introduce two new kinds of bang important to say, like, no, really, go style that stuff. And it's escalating the specificity war, when really what we really need is just some sort of upward-facing protection. And, this is the first version of these standards. That's okay. I think it's fine. But I don't think that, losing the ability to penetrate this without special selectors and sacrificing and having to rewrite your CSS, and it's just, the technology is not there yet, I think, to use. Frankly, I just don't think Shadow DOM is ready for prime time. And it is in browsers where it's implemented, but the only places I'm really seeing these things, Shadow DOM components, used really successfully are places where the entire application is built out of web components. Web components aren't quite yet going into battle in the larger, messier web, where they have to be used alongside other people's code. You see custom elements on github.com, which is actually their timestamps. Their relative timestamps are all done as custom elements, which is super cool. And they're actually using platform.js for that, possibly webcomponents.js now. But you're not seeing a lot of composure between web components and other things. And I think that's where web components really shine. And I'm just not ready to accept that they are how you actually build the entire application, I guess.
And I've heard two different viewpoints on that. Like that's definitely a viewpoint that's shared by many others. And there's the other side of it that, we have this encapsulation now and we should have this scoping. I experienced it where I was very frustrated I couldn't style things. But once I figured out to use how to use : shadow and /deep/, and even before when we had, the cat in the hat, I found that it was, I could force it like with a hammer, to make it work, but it'd be this long selector, like you said, and the performance would drop. Like I could visibly see the performance drop when it was polyfilled. So it's sort of, I'm kind of on the fence either way. I do appreciate both sides of the coin though.
Yeah, and I think there's absolutely, I don't want to discredit people who are, I never want to discredit anyone who is using a technology to successfully build a thing, because you built and shipped a thing, and that was the point. I hate to put on a hat and being like, you're building web things wrong, because I want people building things for the web. That is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of frameworks is to build things with them, not to win at being the best framework. So I would say that this is, it's not a zero-sum game, and the Shadow DOM approach really works well, but it's going to hinder adoption of web components writ large. And I think you look at how React was built to be fast in legacy environments, and you look at web components, which really only work in Chrome, and you see the future and the present. And I'm excited for the future, but I'm hesitant to recommend it for building things for the present.
I actually was thinking about this thing last week. I was at .js, and the maintainer of React was speaking there. He was like, yeah, we want this thing to be fast, but it has to be working server side as well. So they are using this thing that works everywhere. And it got me thinking into kind of like, web components have been a thing that has come up basically out of Google, and they've been pushing for that a lot. But I think the issue is that because it hasn't been kind of like tried to be built by different type of organizations, like React did this thing, and then Ember is going to adopt something similar. I don't know if Angular is trying to do some kind of, how do we call it?
A virtual DOM.
Virtual DOM, yeah. So this kind of, the same notion is being implemented by different vendors. They are approaching the same issues from different angles, and maybe they will end up with something which is better than the browser is, and rendering and everything. Maybe in the future we don't even need to use Shadow DOM because we have this virtual DOM, and everything is going to be way faster. So I wonder if we are having this same issue, that this is a little bit of IndexedDB version 2, but applied to DOM. Like, browser vendors give you something that is super complex and no one can really use it, whereas other vendors, which are kind of independent from browsers, are going to come up with a better solution, which is more, it can be just a polyfill or something that works in browser first, and then it can become something native. So I wonder if that's because that's a result of an old kind of process where some kind of like a mono organization tries to come up with this solution and doesn't expose it for debate for people. And we are going to have to see a web component version 2 where all these problems are addressed, and we have new selectors, and this kind of specificity gets rewarded. So I was thinking about that, like, well, this is something that needs to be thought of.
I have a sort of neighboring concern, which is when you try to build vanilla web components using all the web component specs, you see that they really don't fit together as well as a family of specifications made by the same people should. You run into things like you require all this boilerplate code to make a custom element with Shadow DOM from a template. And then, even then, you see that, oh, for my styles to be encapsulated, I have to inline them. Which is fine because I'm vulcanizing an HTML imports tree, but it's not fine for people who aren't using that tool, and that tool is not part of the spec. And then there are these warts, but the spec is shipped. And it gives me the concern that sort of I earnestly do not wish to cast aspersions, but it feels like Google pushed this spec into production because they had such a good abstraction in Polymer on top of it, and really didn't workshop how the spec could have worked better because they had such a good abstraction. I think building with Shadow DOM directly, building with HTML imports directly, building with web component with custom elements directly, and using the template tag without the benefit of the abstraction, sort of, without the benefit of an abstraction, and without the benefit of just a ton of tooling, is not a pleasant process.
You find eventually that you're building out your own little mini library of helpers.
And you almost always need a build step. And that's new to the web. That's new to the web, that there would be a set of specs that really aren't useful without a build step.
Yeah, it doesn't work locally. That's important.
And doesn't work locally, or has strange behavior locally. Yeah.
For the styles, where you said you can only have inline styles, you could always do an import from there, and that'll pull in.
You can do an import, but you can't use a link tag. It's very interesting. You can do an import, and that's all right, but it's really peculiar to see some of those best practices reversed or just not included in the party. I have not read the lists, all the lists. There may actually be a rationale for why only style is supported versus link, but it seems like the spec is really only complete when you pull in Polymer, and that's something that I think we're going to have to figure out.
I think scripts are a bigger concern even than the link tags, right? So when you have an inline script,
worked on Polymer,
you're going to have you're going to have some problems with CSP. So then you need to vulcanize. So so you could have like an external file, and it's a lot of just forcing yourself for new best practices. And I wonder if HTTP2, when that is the standard in browsers and for applications, because the browsers, it's going to happen pretty quickly, but it's more on the application side where these frameworks need to build it into what they're doing. That's supposed to help with multiple smaller requests. So I wonder if that's sort of the intent with that.
I think, it seems like there's a lot of future tech that's needed for web components to really feel good, and our charter is to ship something that works today, and I think that's led to a lot of the friction. And my connection cut out there, so I think we were actually both talking, and I was not receiving half of your words.
I'll just keep
because of the wonders of the internet. But I want to make it clear that I don't think at any point there was ever malice or any even like lack of thinking of follow through from the people at Google who built out this spec. It's just you need it didn't get socialized on the larger web to the extent that I think it could have been. And if you have a really strong abstraction and you're all using it, why would you? It's that much more tempting. But now we're running into issues like you have the web interface of Inbox, which, as far as I can tell, is built out of web components and uses material design, but seems to have such issues in browsers that aren't Chrome that they actually are hesitant to ship it to anyone but Chrome. So if this is the technology of tomorrow, does that mean Google's products can't be used until everyone gets on board? I mean, that's actually the thing I'm struggling with right now. You look at the paper elements, which are awesome, and the work they went into those, I envy, and they have that high lickability factor. They're really, really well put together. If they're coupled to a technology that doesn't really work well outside of a single browser vendor, do we have a problem?
I've been using Polymer for a while too, and I found that it works best in Chrome for sure, but I haven't had issues in other browsers really that are really bad, and I think I don't like the idea to have it coupled either to a library, and it's just easier, I think, to do. But I'm looking at stuff like in the future, like ES6 classes and imports and things like template strings, especially, that may help not need all of that.
I feel like ES6 modules and HTML imports are fundamentally at odds with one another. I feel like they'd be hard to use them both, and and actually the approach that Brick is probably going for, if in a last-ditch attempt to really find a pattern that is sustainable is actually really using is trying to be future proof by using some ES6, compiling that down into CommonJS, and actually browserifying these bundles. So we have the benefit of a module ecosystem, and we have the benefit of using the newer technology to ease the problems of templating, and then we also have the benefit of having this compiled bundle that actually will work well in a browser. And in fact, that's where we're headed, is actually using custom elements and browserify to use sort of a modern tool chain plus this one special sauce that makes authoring easier in the form of custom elements, and shipping components that are sort of a hybrid of those two approaches.
I also want to say some other thoughts I had, like right now, and I think this is an issue of not having been discussed and exposed in a while. Right now, when you do register element and you register an element, you can only have that version of that element forever in your tree. Whereas with CommonJS modules, you can load several versions of the same module and have it coexist in the same page. So maybe in the future, the register element is going to have to go through something. I mean, I don't really know, because obviously the DOM tree is the DOM tree, and the DOM parser knows one version of the type only. But this is something that people are going to maybe want to do, like have two versions of the Twitter widget. You know, people are doing weird things, but that's something that I don't think has been thought of either. So that's an interesting thing. And once you get ES6 imports or modules, how do you deal with the imports? This thing you can only end up with one winner. You cannot have 3 or 4 different things that kind of do the same thing but don't do the same thing in the same way. It's very confusing.
One of the things for that, on that note though, is I've thought about that too, where it is sort of at odds. But for me, one of the things that I've struggled with, and I've seen people do this in different ways. DivShot just recently did a Firebase Polymer demonstration at Web Components LA. Sharing of third-party JavaScript files or CSS files and things like that. So like for JavaScript files, if you have a library like D3 and you want to pull it into a component, that is not very optimal unless you have some system to, put it back into the window and make sure that it's there, and you have like we have with Require and CommonJS now. But with that encapsulation, it's not as straightforward. So I think imports might be able to help us in that way. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think imports can help that way, but I also think that's also a situation where ES6 modules and sort of embracing that level of compilation and dependency resolution. I guess HTML imports is a very, very web component specific way of solving that problem, but we also have the notion that if I'm building a complex project, I can require or import this D3 dependency in my top level thing, and then also use this other element which is using D3. And if during build the D3s match, we can dedupe.
The other thing is that imports can bleed all over the window object because they are accessing the window thing. But with ES6 modules, you just import thing and get this into a variable, and you're not affecting other things. I think someone put there a very good example, like if you import math, or if you import something into math, and then you do math.something equals something else, you're changing that instance kind of the module. You're not changing all the maths for all the other libraries, not just the original math object. So that really separates boundaries. So that's really interesting. And that could be addressing some of the issues we're having with imports of things messing with other parts of your software. So you can actually reuse things with kind of peace of mind.
And we've been talking a lot about web components in general here, and it's been great conversation. Let's talk about the Brick 2.0 versus 1. One was originally Xtag elements, and what is the relationship between Xtag, Firefox OS, App Maker to Brick, and what was the motivation to get the 2.0 out in October?
Oh gosh, okay, that's quite a few things in there. Xtag is built by I believe it's primarily Daniel Buckner and Aaron Shar, both former Mozillians. Actually, both worked extensively on the Brick project. Brick, frankly, got off the ground because They were such boosters of web components tech, and at the same time that we were also trying to figure out how we could help web developers build application UI, and these two things sort of converged very, very, very cleanly. And then both Daniel and Aaron left for other opportunities, and they sort of took with them the institutional knowledge of Xtag. We looked at, wanting to use all the specifications, and at the time, using all the specifications meant using polyfills out of the Polymer system, probably. And if we're going to use some of the polyfills out of the Polymer system, then we may as well just go use platform.js. So now we have platform.js and Xtag without its polyfill. And we looked at that, and that's when we kind of realized maybe we wanted to be as vanilla as possible, and that's sort of born the decision to transition away from the abstraction that Xtag provided.
Yeah, it was kind of complicated for people to understand another layer. It would be like, oh, I want to do web components with Xtag, so they had to learn Xtag and then understand all the other web components concepts, and it was like too much to understand if you just want to make components.
Yeah, you had to, now you had to teach people people either knew how to build elements with Polymer, knew how to build elements with Xtag, or knew how to build elements using the spec, and it just didn't seem like it was adding an extra bit of confusion to the space, where people already weren't sure how Brick was different from Polymer, and then they weren't sure how Brick was different from Xtag, and then they weren't sure how Xtag was different from Polymer, and I guess having the extra relationship there was doing nobody any services. In the meantime, Xtag has gone on. I believe they're about to land some Shadow DOM support, which is pretty cool, and I'm actually really excited to see other viable polyfills out there that are trying to solve these problems differently, because maybe we can get over the polyfill performance problems, especially as browsers get newer. Yeah, essentially it was just a matter of, hey, if we're going to use all these polyfills, we should use the Polymer polyfills because they're all there.
Yeah, we're going to have Daniel on in about 2 weeks to talk with.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, I wasn't sure if he had been on already or not.
Yeah, we had to reschedule, but he'll be on
okay.
For sure.
I understand that.
And as far as like the components that you're building out, there's not a lot of them.
There's
but
not
it
a
looks
lot
like
right
there's
now.
a lot of care that's taken into them. So how do you deal with contributors, and I shouldn't say how do you deal with them, but who is contributing in the community and also within Mozilla?
We have a couple really active contributors who sort of just glommed onto the project because they were excited, and frankly we wouldn't be able to get enough done without them. We haven't had a ton of contributors come by, and I think a lot of that comes from confusion. A lot of that comes from how new this tech is, and some of the contributors that have come are still confused about relationships and that how all these things differ, and really just trying to figure out how this stuff works. I think a lot of people are daunted or confused when they show up to these projects, and that's something that really has actually, if I'm being completely honest, it's been 18 months since Brick came out, and we've had a lot of trouble with traction, and we're trying to figure out how best to move forward, or whether moving forward is really, since we're just a collection of web components, maybe just sort of dissolving the Brick banner and just building web components individually that all work really well together. And actually, so that's sort of Brick 2.0 going forward, but turns out Brick is a very confusing name. It's a little generic. It's a little generic, and actually, you mentioned AppMaker. AppMaker refers to its Polymer, 100% Polymer-based custom elements or web components that they use within AppMaker as bricks, because I wouldn't. It's a very common noun. So the nomenclature soup has gotten even messier, and that has certainly not helped Brick's traction. So I think your other question, what was the other question?
Firefox OS.
Firefox OS. Brick, there's actually a group of people who are taking Gaia, which is the UI layer of Firefox OS, and actually componentizing the individual pieces of it. It was already sort of componentized, but mostly just as sort of bundles of CSS that were common to each individual piece of the UI, and they're trying to really formalize that actually into custom elements primarily. Maybe a little bit of Shadow DOM, but mostly custom elements. And that's another example of where actually it's not Brick at all. That's just it's just vanilla custom elements, which is fine because they have a very strong internal sense of how all those UI pieces should fit together. Mm-hmm. And and they have a release schedule, and they want to try to transition. They're trying to transition to a new tech while disrupting as little as possible. So they've opted to essentially just build custom elements directly and just sort of port their styles into these nicely encapsulated units, which I think is going to give them more flexibility going forward.
One of the things that Polymer gets dinged for a lot is in their demos, they don't have accessible elements, and so there's a big issue with that in the community. Mm-hmm. Have you guys built in accessibility into these components?
The Gaia components have a lot of that because they have to be accessible. So the reason why they went from building blocks, which was the previous components kind of full quotes, or air quotes, they just had like this site called building blocks, and it was like HTML and CSS that you had to copy and paste if you wanted to get that kind of component. So they moved to having proper components, so you can actually update the thing and kind of like make it very seamless. But it also comes with a lot of work done in accessibility, and it's really great because as soon as you check in something into the project, you're going to get a UI review saying that's not accessible. I cannot navigate to this thing without, like all the. I'm not an expert in accessibility, but basically you're going to have someone yelling at you if you do something that is not accessible because those fonts have to be accessible. So all those components are really looked through a lens, and they made sure that they actually are good. So they are really good quality components.
Yeah, and in terms of Brick accessibility, I think by trying to move away from Shadow DOM, we're at least getting the base accessibility of the DOM back, and then hopefully by using ARIA roles, we can take that, go further on top of that. And I think that's actually another argument possibly to shy away from Shadow DOM for now. I've had a couple conversations with Marcy Sutton, who's an awesome accessibility person who's been making the circuit about this stuff, and yeah, she's does a great talk about actually building an accessible web component. I believe it ordered tacos, which was fantastic. And then, but I'll take the rap on this. It's been such a small team. We've been really struggling to get off the ground and get that little bit of loft or shave the first yak, as I've been trying to say. It's taken so long to shave the first yak that we really haven't made the investment in accessibility that we want to and intend to. We want to, though. I think that's something we're going to have to figure out.
All right. Don't tell Marcy, though.
I want to be a pleasant surprise for her.
Bugs. We have bugs open for accessibility.
Yeah, this bug's open for accessibility.
It's just that we don't have time.
Yeah.
It's really a manpower issue. That's not super unexpected.
So I saw on GitHub there's this generator brick that you did.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good starting point for developers to go through and for building a component?
I think it's a good starting point for a developer who wants to build a component in the current Brick 2.0 style. Right. But I feel like I've spent a solid portion of this this podcast explaining how even we are really strongly reconsidering that. Once we find the pattern, and I think that's where we find a relatively future-proof pattern, which we have about. I think I have to the end of the year to do that. So once I find a decently future-proof pattern, yeah, plenty of time. The generator will likely be updated, but the generator sort of reflects what are the
version
the current state.
The state of our art is, and that's just a Yo brick. It's a Yeoman generator, so it's Yo brick, and it stamps out an element that with a lot of the scaffolding in place. The generator pattern, I mean, Yeoman is awesome for stuff like that. If I'm mocking up a really simple custom element, I actually have a snippet inside of Atom that I can just type custom L tab, and it drops all the prototypes into the page and all the callbacks into the page, and puts the cursor at the beginning of every single line so I can type the name of the element, and it substitutes it all in at the same time. It's actually pretty. I mean, it's really a Yeoman generator in snippet form. There's still a lot of unsolved questions about sort of how to do a common JS custom element, but I would expect that to be updated. That said, right now, the generator brick is actually, I feel like, a really, really strong starting point if you want to build a vanilla custom element that uses all the specs. Which is actually, which I think is a valid thing. I may split that off into a generator vanilla, because I think there's value in that for people who want to go down that path. And there was work that went into making that a decent generator. So there's no reason to throw out the window.
There's also a generator element, if you guys have seen that, which is by Zeno Rocha and a few other people from webcomponents.org. And that'll allow you to do vanilla, Bosonic, Xtag, I think, and Polymer. And it's really good because they run you through the whole, building from start to finish, where you add it to customelements.io, you have it, searchable in Bower. So it's really nice.
Hey, everybody, use that one.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm saying you could add to it. You could.
We could probably try to add a brick thing to it. Yeah. No,
yeah,
that's fabulous.
As far as like developer design, debugging, build tools, what do you recommend when you're working with Brick?
We're using Gulp pretty extensively for our build process and sort of, integration, as you save, rebuilds go. And I believe we're using Gulp plus Vulcanize right now on the current stack to get things packaged together. And that's actually really great for rapid iteration. I feel like Gulp has really established itself as the ability. Gulp, actually what I feel like is interesting about Gulp and why we prefer it to Grunt is because it really is imperative over declarative. And as you sit here and listen to us talk about how we're not huge fans of declarative programming, that might actually kind of explain why Gulp is preferred to Grunt on the team as well, where sort of being able to define in code how this task works as opposed to configuring a series of tasks using JavaScript objects. I feel like they're very apples to apples otherwise between Gulp and Grunt, but it's really this pattern of I'm running a piece of code that says this is my task, and my task is defined by this piece of code. And it's very execution-based versus configuration-based. I feel like the execution-based stuff really just maps cleaner to how the team works, and the ecosystem is pretty competitive. But and also actually I think the stream stuff really feels nice and reflects the notion of a build system as a pipe full of files and assets that go through all these processors and then get dumped out to a file system. It maps pretty well to at least how my brain works, and it seems to work okay for the team.
Yeah, both of them have worked pretty good for me, Grunt and Gulp. I haven't used Broccoli or anything like that, but
no, I haven't used Broccoli. Grunt and Gulp are both good, but Gulp just feels, in my mind, lighter. Whether it is or not remains to be seen, but it feels lighter. It certainly presents itself that way. In terms of debugging, Firefox and Chrome, you need a browser. Chrome's great because you have a browser with all the specs in it, and that are fully implemented. That's pretty critical, and of course, they've done a stellar job of shipping full spec support with dev tools that seem to know what it means. The ability to inspect into Shadow DOM and all that stuff. It's coming in Firefox dev tools, but so is the implementation of the standard. They're both not there yet. So if you want to check that stuff out, you fire up the Chrome dev tools to take a look at the spec implementation. But then in general, I'm spending most of my day in Firefox. Really, I use Chrome to check out, the spec level implementation, but to make sure everything looks right and seems to work correctly. I guess I'm just more used to the Firefox dev tools, and they're in the inspector and style editors there.
What's the current support matrix in the browsers for mobile and desktop?
For Brick?
Yeah.
Right now, I believe using the polyfills, it's evergreens. It's evergreens on desktop, and then we have Chrome and Firefox on Android, and I believe we have iOS support. Firefox OS is
back with a new update.
Firefox OS on later versions.
Then it should be okay now.
For versions of Firefox OS are tied to versions of Firefox. So versions of Firefox OS that reflect sort of the evergreen status of the browser, essentially 2.0 and above, Brick is working on, because that's where the polyfills
except for certified apps, but we don't have any certified app built with. So,
yes.
The issue with Firefox OS is that they have kind of like partial support for web components, but it's only enabled for kind of like important apps that operators might ship or something. The issue is that you try to use the polyfill with those apps, the polyfill won't kick into action because it thinks that it's got super support for web components, and because it doesn't kick into action, you don't get any web component thing to start working. So you end up with non-functioning app.
Yay.
So for all of that.
Yeah, the polyfill looks like Shadow DOM is there, and it looks like HTML imports are there, but really only custom elements is there. So the polyfill just kind of steps back, and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like the FOUC stuff that it just never resolves, right?
It's not a flash of unstyled content. It's a state of unstyled content.
Nice. We we had Steve Newcomb from Famous on, and he talked about mobile performance and what to expect with what they're doing as far as their framework. And they're not web components, I understand. But they're doing a lot as far as performance to get those transitions on, especially like mobile iOS, to get to work better. And they sort of go with the React idea that the DOM is just not capable of these things, and that you should inject everything at the end type of matrices inside of transitions. Or in the future, they're going to start using a mixed mode with DOM and using the GL, the OpenGL through WebGL to do a lot of the animations and things like that to get some crazy performance. So have you optimized for performance as far as the animations with the current widgets that are available?
I would say that as I described, we're still shaving the primary yak. We're still trying to sort of get the framework off the ground, which is frustrating to say a year and a half in. It's the truth. And
well, you don't have 30 people working on the team, so
exactly. So we've been making sure that there's not glaring. There's no we're only transitioning and animating the properties that are getting hardware acceleration as a rule. Absolutely nothing else. And so there is sort of the benefit that comes from that, which is that you're going to get attempted 30 to 60 frames a second, but we haven't done really deep jank analysis or anything like that, and we haven't taken advantage of any of the newer will change or web animations technologies to try to do any animations that really are outside the scope of those. But we're trying to stay faithful to web technologies as close to vanilla as they are. So as a result, that really just means, what is it? Transform and opacity. Okay. Transform, opacity, and then just being really careful to not do things that require, just backing away from hot loops. If you have to do something on scroll, debounce. If you have to do a transition, make sure it's one of the right kinds. And just doing things that use request animation frame whenever possible, so you're not doing more work than the browser is painting. But other than that, not a whole lot else.
Okay.
We haven't gone into nitty-gritty loop debugging with a timeline yet.
And
though I would love to.
One of the other things too is testing for this stuff is not easy. And I know it's been a constant flux, for no pun intended, over in Polymer. So they've been changing the way that they're doing a lot of testing, and it's been sort of not a priority with a lot of things. I don't know for them, but it's very difficult, basically, is what I'm saying, in dealing with Shadow DOM, and in particular. Is there a testing story for Brick, or do you have plans for the future for that?
Yeah, let me pull up some. I'm working on there's a branch I'm working on called Proto, which is a prototype of a sort of the next generation Brick stuff. It's actually not in the Brick repo. I believe it's just on my personal repository. One of the things it's doing is we're actually using Karma and Sauce Labs to do visual and integration testing. And the nice thing about that is we're doing all these builds. We can actually push extra test results up onto Travis. So I have just a really basic skeleton thing. I'm just going to paste this in the chat just in case you want to see it. Essentially, I have a grid of browsers and a custom element, and you can actually just see the screenshots coming out of every individual browser. So that's sort of the baseline visual regression testing. And then on top of that, we're going to have functional and style testing to sort of just ensure this stuff is working properly. Sauce Labs, and I believe we're using WebDriver.io, which is a relatively recently new and nicely abstracted library that sits on top of the WebDriver APIs, and that's been pretty pleasant. Additionally, being able to write these things if we're writing these things as common JS modules, we're going to have access to a much better set of testing, be able to actually possibly do Mocha tests on some of the functions and things like that, because really within any individual file, we don't longer have to use closures and hide these functions, because that's the build step is going to take care of that, meaning we can actually import one of these modules and test on it directly using Mocha, which I think is going to give us a lot better coverage for the individual unit pieces. That's where we're headed, but yeah, it's been slow going.
What are the most interesting projects that you guys have seen?
Let's see. If I'm being perfectly honest, there hasn't been a huge adoption of Brick. And actually a huge integration of Brick into things. I've seen some Brick components used to build an IRC client for Firefox OS,
Nice.
which I liked a lot, using and really using them sort of in the way that we sort of intended. Having this layout that sort of takes care of doing flexbox, then having a tab bar at the bottom, which sort of lets you flip around, and then a deck to have card-based views into every individual room. And it was a very, very nice usage of the tech, but it was called FireC.
Can you guys put links to some of this stuff?
Absolutely, I'm going to drop them in. I dropped at least one thing into the just dropped it into the channel.
For the roadmap, we talked a little bit about that. Scheduled releases that are coming up. Any improved? Do you think you'd be improving the documentation, the demos, and the educational and promotional stuff that we sort of talked about a little bit?
Okay, so in terms of roadmap, I think I've mentioned that I sort of it is a mostly self-imposed deadline to truly try to figure out what's a forward sustainable way to do this project on the skeleton crew, and a lot of that is actually I'm trying to do some of the legwork to get the skeleton of what Brick components can look like finished by the end of this year, and then actually we're going to more or less call a mulligan on 2.0 and do a migration to this much lower profile stack using CommonJS and Browserify and custom elements. And then really probably I think my thinking is really try to become a better part of the custom elements ecosystem and be less of a monolithic project. Sort of not necessarily have Brick be this brand, but it just be a pattern for building custom elements and have a collection that are built by Mozilla that look and really feel nice together, but not try to be this monolithic thing which causes confusion with other monolithic things. And sort of take Brick and the lessons we've learned from Brick and actually make them more a pattern for building custom elements you can use today, and less its own standalone ecosystem. So, and obviously, if we move more into the custom elements and ecosystem, the custom.io stuff, there's more of a documentation and community around all those patterns and things like that. I think that's really what's going to be the future of the project. The future of the project is sort of a diaspora and less of a centralized project. I think that I personally have learned some valuable lessons about trying to do something that is held up as an apples to apples comparison to Polymer on a team of two, as with a team of two people. There's a lot of questions about feature parity, and it's been. I actually have no regrets about the experience, but I think the future of Brick is seeing Brick chopped apart into really just its individual pieces.
Oh, that sounds great. It's like you emphasized earlier that it's not a competitor with Polymer as most people would think. It's something totally different. So that's pretty awesome.
I don't think I personally like this idea of Brick being this kind of exploratory work where we kind of define a work and exploring a good way of making this work in the future rather than providing the components. I'd rather teach people how to build their own components than give them components. And I think that was our issue. People are expecting us to feed them. I just want to teach them how to cook. But I think maybe our future is going to just be this side with how to do a proper component that will work in the future with other components and the kind of bulletproof approach rather than, tell me which component you need and I build it for you, because that's just not scalable. We just don't have the resources. We need to be realistic. It's good to fail and learn. And we've learned a lot this year, so that's pretty awesome.
And everything's changing so fast with this, so we're all learning at a very, very rapid rate and relearning. So
learning constantly, and I think relearning relearning has been the theme of this project.
Yep.
It's been an awesome conversation. I love talking web components. So if anyone wants to contact you guys, pair with you, contribute to the project, how can they find you guys and what's your Twitter handles? So Matt, why don't you start?
Oh yeah, I'm Potch on Twitter, and actually I'm Potch in a lot of other places, but I'm Potch on Twitter and GitHub, and that's POTCH. I'll just look for the giraffe. And then the project is currently on its own GitHub organization at Mozbrick, Mozbrick, and you can that is also the Twitter handle for the project. So those are places you can find me. And yeah, just search for Potch. And if you're not finding cities in South Africa, then you're finding me. So it's not bad.
I am super Soledad. I'm not going to spell it. I'm super bad at spelling. I hope you link to everything. And I'm not even going to spell my domain name because it's too long.
We have it in the notes. So
yeah, see, I'm just relying on the power of the links.
Well, thanks again. We're going to close it out, and I appreciate you guys coming on.
Yeah, Eric, thanks so much. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, the pleasure was mine. This has been great. Thanks.
Take care.
This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3Pillar Global. 3Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3Pillar on the Twitters, it's at 3Pillar Global. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3, the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.